Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Live Your Extraordinary Life podcast. I am thrilled to introduce this week's guest. His name is Jake Kaufman. He's an international transformation coach and spiritual mentor to purpose-driven visionary men and entrepreneurs who are seeking to grow their life and leadership. He supported hundreds of people to thrive and reach the next level in all areas of life, business, and relationships. And his mission is to help people radically heal and transform so that they can achieve their full potential and fulfill their purpose. He also happens to be a new author. And so we're going to delve into his book as well. I'm so thrilled to have him. Welcome to the show, Jake. How are you?
Michelle, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing great, and thank you once again for having me. If there's background noise, forgive me. They're actually replacing the gutters on our house today, and they showed up at our house at about 9 in the morning. I was super confused and surprised as to why they were even here to begin with.
No
Um,
worries.
but
No worries. This is real life. We keep it real here.
yeah, totally. I appreciate that. I figured you and your audience would appreciate the transparency.
Absolutely. All right. We're going to jump right in, Jake, and I'm going to start you off with a deep one. But what does it mean to you to live your extraordinary life?
I love that we're starting off with this question. I'm a firm believer that true transformation is much more about unbecoming, undoing, and unlearning than it is about becoming, learning, or developing. I say that to say, I do believe that our primary task is to not seek after success, but to seek after and uncover all of the barriers within us that stand against it. So when I think about what does it mean to live an extraordinary life, it looks like going in search of and uncovering the barriers within us that stand against an extraordinary life. Because when we do that, success or an extraordinary life simply ensues. It is the natural byproduct of being committed to a cause greater than oneself.
Mm, that's beautiful. I'm going to read something that you wrote, and I want you to expound upon it.
Sure.
You and I were not put on this earth to eke out a less than extraordinary existence. We weren't born to fit in. We were meant to stand out. And to do this, we've got to go inward. To fully know ourselves, we have to learn to love and respect who we are and who we've become because of what's happened to us. Let's talk a little bit about what you mean with the what's happened to us part of this.
hmm Yeah. Well, just so that we're on the same page and just for some context, the word personality literally derives from the Latin word persona, which means mask. So
Mm,
when you think about your personality is not who you are. Your personality is who you've become. Now, our conscious mind is going to convince us that this is who I am, but our conscious mind is what we know. It's our unconscious mind that is who we are, and it's responsible for what we do, which, of course, is what determines all of the results that we have in our lives. So, in order to achieve true transformation, we have to shift the unconscious person and we have to address the level of belief and identity. Most coaching addresses the level of behavior. So, this is where, high performance habits come into play, biohacking, and all of these various things. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, because you do ultimately need to take a different type of action if you want to change the results that you have in your life. But unfortunately, 90% of people who end up hiring a coach or who go through some type of program, whether it's related to their health and fitness, right? And they go through a training program or they hire a personal trainer, whether it be an interpersonal coach who can support them with their personal transformation or their personal development, even a consultant, for example, to support them in scaling their business. 90% of people ultimately end up returning to their former level of behavior and results after the coaching, the support, and the accountability is removed. So, to bring this full circle and to provide an answer to your question around who we've become, until we reconcile the pain from the past, we will inevitably and continually recycle it in the present moment. We will just do so unconsciously or unintentionally. So until we shift the unconscious person, even if we end up getting support, whether it's by means of signing up for a program, going to a seminar, attending a workshop, or hiring a coach, it is highly likely that we ultimately end up returning to our former level of behavior and results.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because I know often what can happen through the coaching process is, and even prior, is you have the awakening, the realization, awakening. And
Yep.
I would say for many of us, there are multiple levels of awakening, right? It's not like
Sure.
when the light switch goes off and we're poof, like a new
Totally.
realization of who we really are. But
Yep.
moments of more lucidity and clarity
Mhm.
of really who we are at the deepest level of consciousness. Um,
Yep.
and quite frankly, at the subconscious level, how how is it that we, through that inner journey, can get to
Mhm.
a place where we're in there and in that space more often than not? Like, how do we
Mhm.
get to that place where we're not just resorting back to old habits
Yep.
and the old ways of living? Particularly
Yep.
because we have an audience here of really high achievers. So they're
Sure.
speaking, they're
Yep.
looking, how do I get to the next level? And we
Mhm.
recognize there's several layers to the onion. How do we get
Totally.
to the deeper heart of the matter?
Yep. So I'm gonna answer this question in 2 parts because I'm a firm believer that we can't ultimately go into our spiritual maturity willingly. I don't believe that, because all the work that you do in an attempt to take yourself there or develop your way to your full potential, in many ways is just bogus self-help on your own terms. It's great to get you started and get you going, but at the end of the day, something outside of you, that your self-discipline, that your strong willpower, that your current mental resources are simply not a match for. That's the only way that we will die to our false self, this persona that we unconsciously take on when we're very young children, which is simply a representation of who we think we need to be in order to be loved and accepted and successful. But it's not who we actually are.
And we get really good as adults perfecting our mini bios for each other.
Totally, yeah, because the primary role of the ego is to maintain the status quo, and the best way for it to do that is to hide the truth from you, right? And this is where we can't see the forest through the trees. We can't read the label from inside the bottle. We're so closely attached to this false persona that we can't see it, and furthermore, we don't know who we are apart from it. So the minute you finally see it, well, then becomes the question of what do I do about this? And that's where most people get stuck. And this is the second part of answering your question, which is most people stop at the level of awareness, right? When we think about reaching like self mastery, for lack of a better phrase, or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, most people get stuck at the level of self awareness when all of a sudden you've come into realization of your internal limiting beliefs or your compensating strategies, the adaptive traits that make up your broader, larger personality that are in direct response to pain or in order to prevent pain from happening. You're simply aware that there are rats in the attic, but the rats are still there. But the ego is going to convince you that, like, oh, I transform because I've come into awareness of what is stopping me, what is holding me back, what is blocking me from reaching my full potential or becoming the highest version of myself. That's where most people stop. There's a very, very big difference and distinction between uncovering something and undoing it.
Mm.
And most people never actually get to that point or that place. They come into self awareness of their internal blocks and barriers, and they think they've moved beyond them because it feels like a breakthrough. It does. It feels like a breakthrough where all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, the way that I am this way is because of my relationship with my dad, or because, you know, the dynamic between me and my mom, because most of this stuff goes back to mom and dad. Um, and it feels like a breakthrough, but really what's happened is that you've had an epiphany. It's simply the self awareness is simply the first step. Self acceptance, which is what I would use to describe like the level of healing or the stage where healing actually occurs when you're undoing these adaptive traits, these compensating strategies that ultimately form this false persona, this false self that we closely identify that is largely just focused on looking good, right? And quote unquote having it all together. And I talk about this in my book, because I ultimately came into awareness of this when I shared my story of sexual abuse on social media. And all of a sudden, all these masks, right? All of these personality traits that I was unconscious to were completely ripped away. That being this guy who perpetually had it all together, quote unquote. Because that's what I started to do after I was abused is I started to act as if. I started to act as if I had it all together, as if I was successful, as if I was fine. And how many people do we know that do this, right?
I
And then
mean,
all of a
we all
sudden,
do.
right, we
This is
all we
probably
all
true.
correct. We all do this to a degree, but that is exactly what you just mentioned. It is a coping strategy or a compensating strategy in order to not have to experience pain. And that is why, for the vast majority of us, our greatest strength is actually an adaptive trait or a compensating strategy in order to avoid experiencing pain. I'll say that one more time for everybody who's listening so we can really wrap our minds around that because it's pardon my language, it's kind of a mind fuck when you think about it. Our greatest strength is actually an adaptation or an overcompensation to avoid experiencing pain.
Mm.
My best example for this is with my story because after I was abused, like I mentioned, the last thing that my ego wanted to have happen was to get hurt again, to get taken advantage of again. So all of a sudden, unconsciously, all of my efforts became driven by self protection. So what did I do? How did this manifest itself? I became a super high performer, three-sport athlete, excelled in academics. I was even, like a statewide recognized artist. I became obsessed with my health and fitness. So you realize very quickly that like this high performer persona that so many of us who are, in the corporate world or who are in entrepreneurship, it was really just we unconsciously took it on in response to something that happened or something that didn't happen early on in childhood.
So that leaves us with a
Yep.
very big question, which I think I'm going to now talk a little bit about this. The Jake's book, Let Love In, the
Mhm.
pain stops when the truth starts. What is one to do?
Well, that's a great question because it's always enlightening to have this conversation. Like it opens up the door for us to step into a greater degree of self awareness around not just what has happened to us, but how it's shaped us. Like my sexual abuse shaped me. And that's how I came into awareness of who I had become because I started to repeat these various patterns. And even though I didn't have language for it at that time, what I would say to my clients is that the pattern always reveals the problem.
Mm.
So even though I was hyper successful in business, I was in the healthcare technology space for a while as an executive, supported this startup. I'm still an owner in the company, in going from virtually nothing to what is now an over 400-person company. And yet, on some very deep inherent level, I was fundamentally unfulfilled and unhappy. And that is a clear cut sign that you have unresolved wounding from the past that is simply recycling itself in the present moment, that nothing outside of you, nothing external can suffice. It was never meant to.
At the same time, when one gets to that place where maybe the status quo of just going through daily existence no longer feels as fulfilling as perhaps ticking off the boxes when we're younger and we think, oh, we've arrived, right? Got the
Yep.
job and got the promotion and made the grade and starting to make bank and that feels
Yep.
good, right? But
Yep.
you get to that place where there's some level of enlightenment, let's just say, or awareness
Yep.
that ain't all it's cracked up to be. There's got to be more, right?
Right.
Like,
Yep.
am I not
Yep.
made for more, or is life's meant to be something more than this?
Yep.
Isn't that
Well,
a next level, or a at least a beginning of a deeper conversation of consciousness or conscious living? Tell me your thoughts.
totally. Yeah. Well, if we think about life in terms of two halves, the infamous psychiatrist Carl Jung talked a lot about this, as do modern day mystics like Richard Rohr or Thomas Merton, if you're familiar with them. They talk about life in terms of two halves. The first half being all about self actualization and individuation, which is essentially what you just described. I got the promotion. I got the job that I always, was hoping for, wanting. I'm now making the money that I always wanted to make. I got the house. I got the car. I got the things. Right. It's all about propping up oneself. And again, not that there's anything inherently wrong with the job that you really desire, or a house and a car and nice things. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of those things. It's all about the unconscious motivation beneath the conscious desire for those things. And as mentioned previously in our episode, in the first half of life, what is the primary driver beneath the desire for those things? It's inadequacy and insecurity.
Seeking love. We all want to be
Correct.
loved and accepted.
Correct. Due to unresolved pain.
Because
So
we come in, we don't want these things, right? When you look at little kids, they're quite content the way things are. At some point, things shift pretty quick.
correct. Right. Because we've all experienced trauma. So let's just throw that out there and put that on the table, because trauma is much more about what happened inside of us as a result of what happened compared to what actually happened. Meaning the stories and the beliefs that we've made up about ourselves, other people, and the world that largely shapes our actions and our decisions. We all have limiting beliefs. And furthermore, we all have a threshold in terms of what we feel safe to receive, in terms of love and intimacy, financial abundance, and opportunity. Anything beyond that feels like a threat to our nervous system. So what are we going to do? We are going to self-sabotage in order to return to safety. So in order to move from the first half of life to what I would refer to as the second half of life, where in the first half it's all about self-actualization and individuation, the second half of life is all about transformation and transcendence. The bridge between those two things is healing, period.
And it becomes a conversation and work of the undoing, not the becoming.
Correct. Which is why we don't achieve our way to our full potential. We actually die our way there.
Oh,
We
that's a
on
a good boss. Dude.
We unbecome our way there. It's the great paradox that none of us want to accept in the first half of life. But the reality is that we suffer to get well, we lose it to find it, we give it away to keep it, we die to live. That's the truth. But in the first half of life, we refuse to accept that. We would much rather get caught up in like the pursuit of success, accomplishment, and achievement.
Well, and we don't know any better. I think there is
Correct.
a level of even the maturity of the young mind. I have a 16-year-old.
Sure.
He's around these conversations that we are having. So there's a
Yep.
level, huh, I see that over there, but I've got to do this over here, right? Like that we all go through.
Yep.
And I almost feel like it's
Totally.
a journey you have to go through in
You
order to
do.
get to the other side.
Correct. Yes, I want to make that clear. There's nothing actually wrong with this stage or this phase that we're talking about. This individuation or self-actualization phase that we all go through in the first half of life. With regard to men and young boys, you talk about having a 16-year-old. They do need to go through that phase where it is all about accomplishment and achievement and success because it gives them this healthy ego structure that they need to know that I have what it takes and I can do it. The problem is most people get stuck there. They get stuck in that phase. We were always meant to move beyond it. Like this high performer persona that we all take on in an attempt to become successful, it was always meant to fall apart.
And let's just clarify, men and women. There are
Correct.
a lot of women, and I know them because I'm one of them,
Yeah.
who have a lot of those achievement, right? Self-actualization through achievement. And I
Yep.
know a lot of folks that get stuck there well beyond midlife,
100%. Yeah,
well
absolutely.
beyond.
Right. Yep. Because, we live in a society that is largely bent on performance, right? And achievement, which, if you grow up in religion or if you grow up in a society like that is bent on achievement and success and accolades, it tees you up for a life of performance. And what I mean by that is you take on these various personality traits, compensating strategies, adaptive characteristics in order to ensure ongoing success. But it's not who you actually are. It's simply who you think you need to be. Right. And that's why transformation is it's always a return home back to your authenticity, back to your true self. That's the great paradox of life is that we're on a journey to become who we already are.
Right.
And to remember who we already are, we've simply forgotten.
Do you find, and I'm really curious because you were coaching already,
Mhm.
or had already gotten into the coaching space
Yep.
before you started writing this book and before
Yep.
you, I think, are at the place you're at now
Mhm.
in knowing. When was your aha moment that you knew that transformation, you were in some awareness phase,
Yep.
but putting all the pieces together? Because I think a lot of people are probably
Mhm.
initially at least saying,
Sure.
what he's saying resonates with me. I want to go work with him to become a high performer. You're like,
Sure, sure, sure.
that's not what it's about. Yes, but that's not
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that inevitably ends up happening, to be clear, because the more you do this work, the more every area of your life stands to improve, whether it's your romantic relationships or simply your personal relationships, your business, your financial abundance, like your health, all of it stands to improve because, you are the core of everything in your life. And the core of you is your inner work, the degree of your emotional intelligence, personal development, and healing. That's what dictates and determines your success in every single one of those areas. So, yes, that does happen, right? Where people inevitably start to experience a greater degree of success in all the various aspects of our lives between health, wealth, and relationships. But it doesn't start there. The conversation can't start there.
Right.
In fact, I would suggest that the first and most important question when it comes to this work, in order for it to be long lasting and sustainable, is what have you been doing with your pain?
Mm.
Our task is not to seek after success. Our task is to seek after and discover all of the barriers within us that stand against it.
At what point, and I think this is, so indicative of the paradox, we go from the doing and the
Mhm,
becoming to the healing
mhm.
and the receiving and the attracting. And not
Sure,
to say, I don't want to overuse the word manifesting because I know it's kind of polarizing, but to
sure.
the extent that when you work on yourself, it's not that it becomes easy, but things become easier in the sense that you're in alignment and there's a
Mhm.
flow perhaps, and you feel a little bit more a return of self. There's a level of authenticity
Right.
that exists.
Yep,
That's the great paradox also, right? Like for the first half of life or more, you're out
yep.
there accomplishing and conquering and doing, and
Overcompensating.
it's draining. It's
Correct.
exhausting.
It is, but that's the path. Personal development, spiritual development, it all follows, um, 3 phases: construction, deconstruction, reconstruction, in order to address the 3 various stages of life, which is overcompensation, which you just mentioned,
Mhm.
decompensation, recompensation, or proper compensation. So, in the overcompensation phase is exactly what we do exactly what you just described, which is like we reach, we strive, we overextend, overexert ourselves in the name of establishing ourselves, propping ourselves up, and developing this developing ourselves, right? As I mentioned, all of that needs to fall apart. Like this identity that this high performer persona that we unconsciously take on in an attempt to become successful that is not genuinely authentically us, that has to fall away. That happens during the deconstruction phase. And that's where we go through growth and healing. And then after we've come out of that phase is when we go into this reconstruction phase, where it's much less about ourselves and much more about others and stepping into giving and contribution, being of higher service to humanity and a purpose that is so much bigger than than ourselves.
How does one know when the
Mhm.
healing has fully occurred, or does it ever fully occur? Number one. And number
Sure.
two, that deconstruction phase, how
Mhm.
does one know when, hey, I'm guessing there's overlap, right? You're going through
Yeah.
deconstruction and reconstruction. Probably at
Sure.
some point there's a little bit of both
Mhm.
happening at the same time.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. There's always this like wobbling phase that we go through where we're trying to find our legs. We're almost like learning how to walk again because we're no longer self-identifying with these personality traits that used to describe us, right? But we unconsciously go back to that because it's what we're habituated to, right? Because if you're, I don't know, if you're 30, 35, it's very likely that a lot of these adaptive traits or compensating strategies you've taken on and reinforced for 25 plus years
And
because
I would say
70% of our
that phase, you're humming at a really good rate still.
right. Oh, totally. Yeah. And so all of this starts when we're around 2 years old.
Mm.
And so by the time you're 30, you're completely unconscious to the fact that, these various personality traits that you have are actually compensating strategies or adaptive traits that are not genuinely, authentically who you are, but who you think you need to be. That ultimately keeps you at odds within yourself and separates you from not just your full potential, but a higher power and a higher purpose. Those are the only things that can bring lasting fulfillment, to be clear. And that's why all of this work, all of this transformational personal development work, if it doesn't put you on the path towards a higher purpose and a higher power, you need to get rid of it. I don't care if it's working with a personal trainer. I don't care what the focus of it is. If you're hiring a business consultant to, help you scale your business, if you, not that there's anything wrong with those things, but if you are not actively, consistently working towards a relationship with a higher purpose and a higher power, you need to reevaluate what you're investing in. Because that's ultimately where we all have to get to if we ever hope to reach lasting fulfillment.
And
It's
peace,
the only thing,
right?
correct,
That's
and
the
internal
key.
peace.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The peace that surpasses all understanding. That's the only thing that will do it. Nothing outside of us will ever be able to suffice. I coach a lot of highly successful people, because I have a corporate background, just like you, who come to me who've achieved a lot, and yet on some level they are empty and wanting, and they don't know why. They're like, why do I feel this way? I've accomplished everything that I've put my mind to or set out to do, and yet here I am having achieved it, and on some inherent level, I'm unhappy and I'm unfulfilled. That is a very dark, lonely place,
Oh,
especially if you don't know what to do about it. Right. And that's where, someone like myself comes in.
I where were you, Jake
Mhm.
Kaufman, when I was 26 years old, going to grad school full time and working full time, going 150 miles an hour, and realizing that all the things that I had been told, quote unquote, be grateful for, you are the it girl. It's all
Mhm.
happening for you. It is
Sure.
amazing. You are doing it. You left the small town. You're in the big city. You're conquering. And
Yep.
I
And that's great. And
was
that's great.
it was really great for a little while,
Correct.
and then I could not and I was quite young still, could not reconcile, then why do I feel so empty if it's
Totally.
great? And
Yeah.
that took it can take a very scary toll on somebody who isn't yet in the emotional maturity phase of understanding that this is
Right.
the way.
Yep. That's normal, right? It's normal. All of these things have to end up proving to be incomplete and insufficient in terms of helping you establish and achieve happiness, because that's what then forces you to go on this further journey where you all of a sudden pursue a higher purpose and a higher power, right? Because it's only those things that offer a higher force for living and being. That's why they're so important. I mean, how many people do you know have achieved an incredible amount, and it wasn't until they found spirituality that all of a sudden they started to become happy, right?
I mean
And
that
and
uh,
and achieve fulfillment, right? Because spirituality, which I'm using like more as a blanket term to describe, a higher purpose and a higher power, that is the only higher force for living that seems to do the trick for us in terms of long lasting fulfillment.
So, will you just set me up to
Right.
going down this path for a little bit because I want to hear about how it happened for you. Here I
Mhm.
was, literally on the verge of my health was deteriorating. I was burning
Yeah.
out. I was
Yep.
feeling empty and lonely. What is the purpose? What's the meaning? It's all for nothing. I've given it all. And I'm in a
Yep.
dark place.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I won't give you away the punchline here, but ultimately, it did turn into an inward journey, very
Sure.
young for me.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the advent. This is going back a while now.
Yep.
When we had the Deepak Chopra was coming out and Wayne Dyer was
Sure.
starting and Marianne Williamson was just
Yep.
coming out with and
Sure.
it's spoke so resonantly to that place I was. Now, it wasn't like we talked about this earlier. There was no light switch that completely went off and stayed on. It was this,
Sure.
this feels so radically different and authentic and real. And like me, this is, I
Yeah.
in some space where I can coexist. This feels better. Again, I went on a very long journey even beyond that moment, but that was probably the beginning for me. When
Sure.
was that moment for you and what was happening? Because God knows this guidebook does not exist.
Mhm.
We're not handed the life manual of here are the three stages of life we're going to go through. So just
Totally.
right, this is
Right.
normal. All the stuff
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
feeling that dark place you find yourself in, don't fret. It's okay.
Yep.
That would be helpful. But how
It
did
would be very helpful.
we should probably talk about that. Maybe that's your
Yeah.
what? Um, you have so much insight and you're in a place of knowing that is not common. And I'm very curious, how did you get here? What was
Mhm.
up for you?
Yeah.
And how did you connect all these dots?
Great question. And well, my book literally starts off with me. So this would have been in my mid-20s when I started to again, I started to notice that despite my current level of success, I was repeating these various patterns that prevented me from getting to the next level, simply put. So intuitively, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what's behind this. Like, what is driving these various behavior patterns that's preventing me or blocking me from being more successful than I already am? And that's when I started going to therapy and seeing a counselor. And it was in our first few sessions where we ultimately came into relationship with the fact that I had been sexually abused when I was roughly 12 or 13 years old, which at the time was simply treated as a joke. And so what did I do as a 12 or 13-year-old? I treated it as a joke. So I didn't label it for what it actually was, that being abuse. So I just brushed it under the rug and just ignored it until in my mid to late 20s, here I am kind of bumping up against this like glass ceiling and I'm having this like upper limit moment where I've achieved a certain level of success, but I'm having a difficult time going beyond that and reaching the next level and being that much more successful. And I'm like, what is going on here? Right. I can't figure this out. And so that's when I was finally able to connect the dots because I was like, oh, this experience created a very deep-seated fear of intimacy and connection. Because as you can probably imagine, after someone experiences, abuse or assault, whether it's sexual, physical, or otherwise, oftentimes the result is feeling fundamentally unsafe with regard to deep connection, vulnerability, and intimacy. All of these things that are kind of required to create or experience success in relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a professional relationship or a personal relationship, a platonic relationship. And so finally, I was able to connect the dots and be like, oh, it's because of this that I have become this way, right? I've taken on these various compensating strategies, survival strategies, personality characteristics, and traits that is blocking me or preventing me from being more successful than I already am. And that's what sent me down the path of transformation because it was this catalyzing moment of coming into full relationship with who I had become in response to pain that was preventing me from stepping into more purposeful living and reaching my full potential. The moment I started down that path, like you mentioned, this growth journey that we all talk about, it's very much like peeling back the layers of an onion. Like the moment you think you've figured it out, it's like, oh, and there's another layer, which
Needs
is
apple, needs apple. Yeah.
exactly, yep, absolutely. And so that's very normal. Um, but it wasn't until years later through the process of this unfolding, because most people will hire a coach for 3 months or go see a therapist for a year and then they're like, I'm good. And it's like, Well, you've spent 2 or 3 decades, um, overcompensating. You've just been doing it unconsciously and further reinforcing these personality traits that are not actually you, that are blocking you from getting to the next level or reaching your full potential. Like, it doesn't work that way. Like, this has to become a lifestyle, if you wanna hope to achieve some relative level of self-mastery. I was actually talking with a client about this yesterday. One of my clients he's a natural bodybuilder, and the before and after picture that he uses, because obviously that's what he supports his clients with, is their physical fitness. The gap is 12 years between, like, before he found fitness and, like, where he is at today, right? Because you look at him and you're like, "Okay, clearly this guy has," he's won bodybuilding competitions and all of these various awards, so one would say that he has reached a certain level of quote unquote "self-mastery." But the gap is 12 years, that's a long time. And so this has to become a lifestyle. Let's just, like, get that out on the table first and foremost. It has to become a lifestyle. But for me, it wasn't until like 4 years in to my growth journey. So here I am, that entire time I've been consistently working with either a coach or a therapist. I've been consistently attending workshops, seminars, um, experiential group programs, all aimed at personal growth and development. That I posted my story of sexual abuse on social media, and my nervous system collapsed as a result of that,
I'm sure.
bec because the level of connection was too much.
Ah.
Because all of a sudden I started to receive all of these messages from people, like friends, close friends and family members and coworkers, but also, like, people I didn't even know and had never been connected to, because I shared it on Facebook and Instagram, so it was public, so anybody could see it. So I'm receiving an abundance of, like, text messages and phone calls and DMs from, my closest friends and family members, all the way to clients and people that I've never met before who have experienced something similar. So the level of connection was just too much for my nervous system. And so, uh, the way to think about it is I essentially experienced a panic attack on steroids. So here I am 4 years into my growth journey again. And I'm thinking like, "Okay, I'm like, I've got this, right? I'm pretty far along, I really know myself and all of the, different limiting beliefs and interpersonal blocks and barriers, and I've worked through a lot of those things." And now, all of a sudden, I feel like I'm at the beginning again, because here I am having shared this incredibly shameful part of my story that, I mean, yes, for 15 years, I was very unconscious to, right? And I wasn't properly labeling the experience for what it was. But here I am 4 years into having identified that experience for what it was. And I still haven't shared it with really anyone outside of, like, my parents and a very, very close friend. That was it. So in many ways, it was still very, very much a secret. And if you're familiar with the work of Brene Brown, she says that shame needs three things to thrive, and that's secrecy, silence, and judgment. And so, despite my progress, because I had made a ton of progress, of course, that's when I started to get into healthcare, and the company exploded. And here I am as this equity owner, like, making a lot of money, more than I ever had before in my life, and we're, achieving an incredible degree of success. I think we had just um, successfully raised a Series A round of funding, so, like, over $7 million. Here I am thinking I've got it all together, and I share my story on social media, which was very much inspired by wanting to inspire other people to step into their own growth and healing. And here I am feeling like I'm a beginner yet again, because now I'm starting to experience all of these health problems as a result of like these recurring panic attacks that came from the level of like vulnerability that was created when all of a sudden I shared my story and I just couldn't take it because all of these masks that I started to unconsciously wear at 12, 13 years old, this guy that has it all together, quote unquote, that's quote unquote successful or quote unquote fine. All of that was ripped away in that moment.
At the same time, I'm curious, the level of connection and resonance that you created by sharing your story had to have just had this ripple effect out in the world.
Yeah.
Were you able to be in receipt of any of that connection, or was it overload for you?
It was absolutely overload. Trauma is defined as anything that's too much, too soon, too fast, or too slow, too little, not enough. And so for me, it was definitely too much, too soon, too fast. I never could have predicted that that would have happened because again, I had been working on myself for like 4 years now and I thought that I had reconciled this experience in a very big way. And I had. I had simply done so within the context of my relationship with myself. But transformation isn't complete until it's integrated within the context of our relationships and community. And that's what happened is all of a sudden I shared this shameful secret with my broader network, my community, and that's where my next layer of growth and healing revealed itself.
Mm, thank you for sharing that. Tell me a little bit about maybe the misperception or
Sure.
the lack of awareness or understanding that people have about the coaching journey when they start with you. Because I'm
Yeah.
sure they go in thinking it's one thing, and then they find out during the process that it's
Mhm.
not necessarily what they thought.
Sure, sure. Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm fairly transparent with my clients that this is ultimately like the path that we need to take in order for you to accomplish your goals, get to the next level, reach your full potential. This is the path that we have to take because reconstruction without deconstruction will always be incomplete and insufficient. It will be like building a house on sand. And there's no greater evidence to reinforce that fact than what I mentioned earlier, which is 90% of people who end up hiring a coach or a personal trainer or a business consultant, they ultimately end up returning to their former level of behavior and results. We see this very predominantly uh, with binge eating and yo yo dieting, for example. Most people simply rubber band back after the coaching, the support, and the accountability is removed, which is why yo-yo dieting is such a pervasive problem. Um, so in my mind, that's all the evidence that you need to know that you have to start right with addressing the internal blocks and barriers that are preventing you from the next level, getting to the next level, or reaching the next level of success in your life, whatever that looks like for you. Because everyone's definition of success, of course, is different, and it's a very subjective conversation. But you have to start there if you actually want it to stick, if you want it to be long lasting and sustainable.
I would I'm curious because you said something earlier that makes me think that this is what you were suggesting. But the pursuit of that success, but however you want to define it, is insufficient in itself for that
Hmm.
peace and that the peace that surpasses all understanding that we all want in our lives.
Yeah.
That it really is about that greater impact, your purpose for being, what you're going to do out in the world, that connection to
Yep.
community, whatever that is, that higher purpose, which
Correct.
I'm assuming is different for everybody and how it
Yes.
manifests. But the focus on that versus the building of the next thing and the reconstruction phase, I'm very curious because I see a lot of people going, I'm just focused now that I am in this personal development space on becoming
Yeah.
the best. fill in the blank, entrepreneur, coach,
Sure.
author I can be. And I
Yep. And that's great.
offer, and it's great and it's
Yep.
good. I'll need it, right?
Totally.
Need the light. At the same time, I'm curious whether there's a different way of approaching it, which is in the pursuit of impact and purpose.
Yep.
Maybe that becomes the way rather than, as I think you were saying even earlier, people get really caught up in, I got to build this business and it has to look this way and I have to do these things.
Mhm.
And how do you reconcile that pull and that tug as we go through that transformation process?
Well, I do think that on some level, the desire for more is natural and normal. In many ways, I think that desire is expansion seeking to express itself. And I think Viktor Frankl sums this up really perfectly. If you're familiar with him, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. So, some background, Nietzsche was his philosophy was will to power, that man is driven by his pursuit and his desire for power. Freud came along and said, I don't think that's true. His philosophy was um, will to pleasure, right? Man's primary motivation is the pursuit of pleasure. And then Viktor Frankl came along and said, I don't think that's true. I think it's will to purpose. That man's primary need is for meaning and significance and purpose. So he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And I think this quote sums it up perfectly, which is don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do and go on to carry it out to the best of your knowledge and ability. Then you will live to see that in the long run, success will follow you precisely because you have forgotten to think about it.
Well, that's a mic drop moment. And while I would love to spend the whole day with you, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're probably out of time. But I thank you profusely for everything you've given us today. Let people know where they can find you. We obviously are going to have the links to your
Sure.
IG and your book in show notes, but why don't you go ahead for those that are listening right now? They can get it and do a quick search for you.
Yeah. So the best place to interact with me is on my Instagram, which is I am Jake Kaufman. That's Kauffman. Otherwise, you can always go to my website, awakewithjake.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. And then, like you mentioned, you can find my book on Amazon, Let Love In, The Pain Stops When the Truth Starts by Jacob Kaufman.
Jake, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. It was everything and more than I was expecting. And I hope that you'll come back so we can continue it. I feel like we've just scratched the surface and there's so much more to uncover. But thank you again for everything, for your honesty, for your vulnerability, and for your light. You really are a true light in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate you having me.